Of course, move on. I'm going to, of course, like I said, talk about the rise of, Prussia, which the Prussian state, was a major state that developed in the northern part of Central Europe. Of course, by the time of Frederick the Great, you see, of course, in that picture on the right, Prussia becomes a major power. Of course, they call it Old Fritz. Of course, it's a nickname that Frederick the Great is known by. Overall. So yeah, we're going to talk today about, the rise of Prussia, which, Prussia later becomes a major kingdom, 1701 up to World War I. It's, of course, later part of the so-called German Empire that will develop later in the late 18th century. And talk a little bit of background about the Prussian state. It was not originally called Prussia. Of course, the original name they dubbed it was, of course, Brandenburg, Prussia. That's the name they called it first, going back to like the 17th century. And Prussia developed under this dynasty that was called Hohenzollern. It was named after a famous castle in mountain that's kind of like in the southwestern part of Germany today. And so they got the name Hohenzollern that was later used for the dynasty. I think the dynasty went back to the late Middle Ages a long time ago. Of course, the name Prussia has been around. They think that was a name that went back to the Middle Ages as well. There's two theories about how the word Prussia originated a long time ago. One theory is that if you know about the Vikings that came into Northern Europe, they were sometimes called the Russ, R-U-S. I think in Germany, they sometimes called them Pruss, P-R-U-S. So that's one theory about where it came from. The main theory, of course, where it actually came from, though, was the so-called Old Prussians, which inhabited Northern Germany. Old Prussians were these Teutonic knights that fought during the Crusades. They helped to kind of establish kind of the early part of Prussia in northern Germany, like where Berlin is today. And so they think that was another theory about where the word Prussia came from. I heard another theory, too, that it was named after somebody named Prussia as well. I think I've heard that theory, but I don't know if that's actually true or not. Here's a map showing you, by the way, the actual Prussian state, kind of where it is. It's kind of up there, the northern part of, I guess, what we now call the, Germany, or what we now call the Holy Roman Empire. Holy Roman Empire is in those red lines, of course, right here. So basically, the Prussian state really developed in two areas. An area called Brandenburg, which is right here, and another area called Prussia or East Prussia, which is right here. Although the names are actually called sometimes Electorate of Brandenburg and the Duchy of Prussia. I think there's another name that they sometimes call it as well, which I'll mention, which is, I've got the name here somewhere. There it is right there. They also call it the Margravate of Brandenburg is another name they call the Electorate of Brandenburg. It's called either one with that, but Prussia itself was consisted of those two states over time that merged into one state. And they each had capitals, by the way. Prussia had a capital at Berlin, northern Germany. Berlin's now the capital of Germany now, Republic of Germany, and then the Electorate of Brandenburg had a capital of Königsberg. Königsberg is not part of Germany anymore. It's now part of Kaliningrad, which is something the Soviets kind of developed after World War II, kind of involved in the Cold War later. And so that's kind of how, the Prussian state will form. And Prussia will become kind of an important state, they think, after the 30 Years' War. Like Austria and Prussia, they kind of emerge after that war. And a lot of it was from a combination of wars that formed Prussia, but also intermarriage between, like, say, Prussia and Brandenburg. Looks like Samantha's also joining us this morning as well. So that's kind of like the origin, of where, the Prussian state came from initially a long time ago. I am going to talk about some of the early rulers that were kind of important that led to the rise of Prussia in general. You have a ruler named Frederick William, who later is known as the so-called Great Elector. They called him Great Elector because he was a kind of a great statesman, but also a great, like a military type figure or general that was under the early Prussian state. And he ruled in the 1600s. I got the dates up here, but 1640 to 1688, he ruled over the Prussian state. It was not a kingdom. Like I said, it was a combination of territories, which were two areas mostly, one called Brandenburg in northern Germany now, and the other area called Prussia, or the Duchy of Prussia, which was, I think at the time, above Poland was where it was. They also call it later East Prussia in Germany. And he was very instrumental in wooing a lot of the nobility to kind of join the state. And a lot of the German nobility that would control the military later were known as the Junkers. The word Junker is a term that means either young lord or young nobleman, basically. And a lot of these men were the men that would, like nobility, that would control like the armies. They would be like the main generals under a lot of the kings later of the Prussian state. And you know about a lot of the nobility later that were kind of in the military, all that. They traditionally had this surname particle in their name you may have heard of, which is von, like von Bismarck or whatever, von Manstein, or von Richthofen, like the Red Baron or something like that. And so that's a typical German noble, like surname type title that they're kind of known for later. So Frederick William is the one that kind of creates it into this absolute type state that Prussia will kind of have later on. And so a lot of people kind of view him as being the father of the Prussian state, but he's not a king, like I said. He's like an elector of Brandenburg and then a duke of Prussia. I haven't really explained about the whole elector thing, but if you study about the Holy Roman Empire, the position of emperor was an elected position. And so there were all these so-called electors that were throughout Germany that would elect, the actual emperor. I think most of them would elect, usually it seemed like every time like a Habsburg, but he was like important in, of course, doing that. So now they think after his death, what's going to happen is the kingdom of Prussia is going to emerge in the early 18th century. And Prussia is going to have 9 rulers that will rule over the state up to World War I. I think the first 6 are kings, and then the last 3 are kind of like emperors of Germany, which are called later Kaiser. A Kaiser is what the Germans called an emperor, which evolved from the old word Caesar, from the Romans. And so, they'll have 9 rulers for over a period over 200 years. And I think the word Prussia is actually used in Germany up to like World War II. And it was later disbanded by the Allies after World War II in 1947. So the word is kind of around, or the term. And Prussia is a kind of a major state that's part of the German Empire, even up through the German Second Reich, up to World War I, and then the Third Reich, even later. But it's disbanded as a term now, today. Now, a little bit about the Prussian monarchs too. By the way, they reigned from Potsdam because they were showing all those palaces. They were talking like Sanssouci, and I think it was like the new palace at Potsdam. Of course, a lot of these monarchs ruled. Potsdam is the capital of Brandenburg. If you know about Germany, it's separated into all these different states that they have, like the United States. It's a federal republic, Germany. And then Berlin is the capital of Prussia, and later the capital of Germany, which it'll be, of course, later. Let me also talk about another famous ruler, of course, of the Kingdom of Prussia that we'll get to. And that is, of course, this particular famous ruler, which is Frederick I, who, if you study about Frederick was the first Prussian king. He reigned from 1701 to 1713. Originally, he was called Frederick III because he was the Duke of Prussia. and also the Elector of Brandenburg. He was a son of Frederick William, the Great Elector, the previous ruler. However, what happened to make Prussia into a kingdom was that the Holy Roman Empire in 1700 recognized Prussia as a kingdom. There was this treaty made between the Holy Roman Empire and Prussia, which was called the Crown Treaty. It was signed officially on November 16, 1700. And that led to Prussia becoming a viable kingdom. However, the only thing was, if you know about this, was that only in Prussia. I think they got the title King in Prussia initially, and they were still, the Duke of Brandenburg. But in this case, the Prussian state is starting to kind of become more viable. Part of why the Prussians got this kingdom was because of the fact that Leopold knew this war was going to break out over Spain, because the Habsburg king I talked about before, Charles II, was childless. He didn't have any children. And so the throne was going to go to Bourbon, which, is controversial. And so Leopold formed this alliance, which was called different names, League of Augsburg, or I think they call it the Grand Alliance, in Europe. And so they wanted Prussian support in this war to fight France, and I guess also Spain and all that. And so Leopold actually tried to put two of his sons on the throne. He tried to put Joseph first on the throne, I think, but he would die later, I think, of smallpox. And then Charles VI even tried to get the throne too. Remember the one with the pragmatic sanction later. But eventually the Bourbons won out, and Philip of Anjou, or Philip V, ended up, of course, taking over Spain. So that was something that's kind of interesting, but that's how basically Frederick, ends up on the throne as the first Prussian king. He's actually crowned not in Berlin, he's crowned in Königsberg on January 18, 1701. So that's the official date of when the Kingdom of Prussia actually began. So in 1701. It's not really known for too much else, I think, for just being the first king, and all that. But that's basically how Prussia came about to becoming king. But like I said, he was only king in Prussia, not king of Prussia. That title will not be adopted until Frederick the Great, of course, later. So, but he's still Elector of Brandenburg, which is still part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. So yeah, Frederick the First, of course, we're looking at right there with that. Now, we also have another ruler who was famous, who came afterwards, which was Frederick I's son. Now, they're all Frederick. Frederick's a popular name, of course, and Frederick William, either one. So you got Frederick William I who comes in. Of course, don't confuse him with his grandfather, Frederick William, the Great Elector, because he's a king. So he's the second Prussian king that we have. You can see he reigned from 1713 to 1740. Frederick William I, by the way, is considered the most absolute of the different Prussian rulers. I think he and his, of course, son, we'll get to later, Frederick the Great, was a very militaristic type ruler. Throughout his reign, he basically garnered kind of this nickname that became well known among the German people. He was called later the so-called Soldier King, or the Soldier King of Prussia. And he would dress up in military style uniforms all the time. You'll see this later with a lot of these kings that come militaristic, kind of like an early Napoleon or something like that at the time. Looks like Michelle is also joining us this morning. So if you're having a great morning out there. So he kind of create this military cult or military society throughout Germany, which Germany is known for. By the way, they're known for their military traditions, military, society. Hey, Julie, hope you're having a good morning too. One of the things he did that's very famous, I didn't want to mention about with Frederick William, was he developed the what they call the canton system, which is something that the Prussians use a lot from about the 18th to the 19th century. It was a form of recruitment like a draft throughout their country. And what they would do, they divided up Prussia into like they call cantons. So kind of like almost like a parish or something like that, or a county. And each county would have to draft like a amount of forces for the Prussian army. And so it got to the point where this allowed the Prussian state to increase its military. And so Prussia, I think under him, increased their armies up to like a little over 80,000 troops. So I think it doubled in size. I think under Frederick William the Great Elector, it was maybe like around 40,000. But by the time of his reign, it was about 80,000 or more. I think under Frederick the Great, it would be double that or more. And so it became one of the largest armies in Europe. I think they say the fourth largest army on the continent of Europe, behind France, probably Russia and Austria, those three countries. And it's crazy, but Prussia at the time was the 13th largest population in Europe, just to kind of give you an idea about how big of an army this was compared to their actual state itself. They say in the Prussian state, and it became such a military society, 1 out of 28 men were in the military, which is a lot. If you think about today, like say United States or maybe the British Empire, that's a pretty large amount. Looks like Courtney's also joining us a little later as well, so I hope you're having a good morning. But there's an old saying they used to say about Prussia, which they're not sure who exactly said it, but the famous quote was this: Prussia's not a state that possesses an army, but an army that possesses a state. So that's kind of that old saying about the Prussians, and this tradition, is something that occurs later. Like, you get to the 18th, 19th centuries, and there's a lot of other states that want to recruit, German mercenaries, to fight in various wars. Like in, the American Revolution, there were even, German soldiers that came to fight, in that war. Napoleon, drafted a lot of Germans, to fight in some of his armies as well. So the traditional German soldier officers were some of the best, in Europe. And even up to going up to World War I, World War II, the Germans had some of the best generals, in a lot of wars. There's one thing that he's famous for, by the way. If you study about Frederick William, he had this special, kind of like almost like an imperial guard that he had that was called the Potsdam Giants. They're sometimes called by the Germans so-called Longfellows. And it was a special Prussian infantry unit of very tall men. It was kind of like an elite guard that he had, which these men were much taller than the average, European at the time. And I think the average height was 6'2", which is around my height. But in Europe, an average man was probably 5'6" or something like that. Way shorter than that. And so these guys were giants. They couldn't really be used on the battlefield, but it was a special unit that he would kind of have. There's a guy like you see on that one on the far right. There was one guy I know that was, I think, from, I want to say Ireland or one of those states in Britain that they recruited. He was 7'1", really ridiculous. So a lot of these men couldn't really be soldiers on the battlefield. They were just, too tall or awkward. But I think sometimes he would have these men, even if he was sick or something, he'd have them parade through his bedroom or something like that to cheer him up. And they even had a mascot, which was a bear. Like BRCC. Interesting about that, the Potsdam Giants. So that's kind of interesting later. All these, states like, Napoleon later, famous for his imperial guard and things like that. You start to see that later with, later type states like empires or whatever. Right. Now, there's, of course, another thing that was kind of an issue. If you go back to, talking about Frederick William the First, he had a horrible relationship with his son, a very rough relationship. In fact, Frederick William was very tough on his children, very conservative type ruler. They didn't get along. Like Frederick, later we talk about him, we saw in the video, he liked a lot of French culture, French music, art, and things like that impressed him, the Enlightenment. His father didn't really like the Enlightenment and all that stuff. And I think early in Frederick's early life, he didn't really want to be a soldier. He didn't really want to be the king of Prussia. to take his father's place after he died. And there was this incident that happened in 1730 called the Von Katt affair. And I don't know if you know about Frederick the Great. We'll talk about later a lot. They believe Frederick was gay. He liked men. Anyway, he had this affair with this Prussian soldier, and they were going to run away together, like to a foreign country or something, and leave Prussia. His father caught him. And what happened was he ended up executing Von Katt. Actually killed him. He actually made Frederick watch and get his head cut off. I think he was going to execute Frederick the Great as well, kill him too. But the Holy Roman Emperor intervened at the time, which I think was Charles VI, I believe it was. So anyway, that's kind of the story of Frederick the Great and his father. They didn't get along, but after his father died, the weird thing was that Frederick became a really great king of Prussia, but he still, liked the Enlightenment, of course, and all that. So that's the next thing I want to talk about, of course, is the rise of Frederick the Great. Frederick, of course, came in the same year as Maria Theresa of Austria. Those two rose to power in 1740. Charles VI died in 1740. So she came in because of the Pragmatic Sanction. And then Frederick William I died. And so Frederick became Frederick II, or now Frederick the Great, of course, comes in as the ruler. I'll get to it later. The two did not like each other. They hated each other. I think I talked about this before, how Maria Theresa kind of called Frederick the Great that evil man and all that. But talk a little bit about the rise of Frederick the Great in general. Of course, he's known by different pictures of Frederick the Great. There he is, of course, as a great soldier, which we'll talk about later. He was seen as this mastermind of military tactics on the battlefield. Of course, they later called him the Old Fritz, which if you want the German, it's Der Alt Fritz. And of course, the German Fritz is a common nickname. They call, Frederick, the name Frederick, throughout Germany. He is considered still to be one of the greatest rulers in German history today. He's one of the longest reigning, over 40 years. You can see 1740 to about 1786. One thing about Frederick the Great, he's seen as this enlightened despot. In fact, he might be one of the most famous enlightened despots in Europe. I think him and Joseph II, I think, were the most famous ones they always talk about. And then maybe after that, Catherine the Great and Maria Theresa. And one of the things that Frederick favored was reforming the Prussian state. He wanted to make it more modernized, like other foreign countries in Europe. He looked up to France, as you know. He liked French culture, studying it, French art, poetry in general. He also preferred the title First Servant of the State. That was his title. I think he said that once. I am the first servant of the state, which was different from, say, Louis XIV, who said, I am the state. That's one of the differences between, I guess, him, in Prussia versus, of course, the French absolutism that was there. He was a main patronage to like art and culture, architecture, things like that, parks in general. He was a major proponent, of the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason. And he was known for corresponding with a lot of famous enlightened thinkers at the time, like especially, I think, the writer Voltaire in France was like one of his best friends that he was known by. And of course, he wrote music. They talked about a little short video about how he played the flute in general. So all of his books in his, palace were all in French and not in German and things like that. So he was a love of French, culture in general. Later, I'll get to it later, but one of the things that why Frederick is important is because he makes the Prussian state like a world power, like a major power in Europe to rival some of these other states that are there, like the Russians and the Austrians and the French and the British. He even, begins to try to combine all the Prussian lands, like Silesia, Saxony, and other areas into like one large German type state, which he wanted to form. He also was the first to use the title King of Prussia. So from 1772, up to I think 1870, all the rulers of Prussia are called King of Prussia. Then later they're called Kaiser. I think started in 1871 up to 1918, the World War I. Let me also talk about some things that he's known for. Frederick the Great was known for a lot of reforms to his state. They'll kind of go through some examples of some of the things that he did throughout the country. Of course, just like, that happened in Austria. I think we were talking about how they had those emancipations, like of Jews and giving religious rights to like Protestants. Well, in Prussia, they began to give religious rights to Catholics and Jews, because about Prussia, they were mostly a Protestant state. I think most of the rulers, I think going back to, I want to say Frederick William the Great, Elector, were, I think, mostly Calvinists. I know he was a Calvinist. I know that for sure. But so you just get in the 18th century, you get the emancipation of the Jews. This is the time of Moses Mendelssohn, if you ever heard of him, who helped start the whole Jewish Enlightenment that happened in Europe. And so a lot of the Jews, are not living in ghettos anymore after that, and they start becoming more emancipated, throughout Germany and other areas in Central Western Europe, etc. Similar to Joseph II, he abolished serfdom. He got rid of torture. He even created this civil law code system for Germany. Just got all kinds of names. It was originally called I guess one name they call it is the Frederican Code, which he helped develop initially throughout his reign, and it was eventually codified by 1792. And it's a very important code, by the way, the Frederican Code, because it was heavily influenced by the Justinian Code, which went back to the Byzantine Empire. And they think this code later influenced the Code Napoleon, or Napoleonic Code, that Napoleon Bonaparte develops in the early 1800s in France. And of course, that'll later spread all throughout Europe, these types of new kind of reformed civil codes, but you'll make, people more equal, mostly as men at the time, but that's some examples of some reforms that he was known for. Also, Frederick was famous for bringing in like education reform. One thing that happens, they create compulsory education for all like males and females throughout the Prussian state. You'll see that later in other states. They start doing this throughout Europe. In Prussia, later now in Germany and other states, they start breaking down education into two different types of schools. They have what they call a real school, which is a type of secondary school where you would go for like, I think about 6 years, kind of like middle school and high school, and you would get a trade, like some kind of skill, like become a blacksmith or whatever kind of skill, electrician or whatever you're going to do, I guess, later on type skills. And then a gymnasium was a type of college preparatory type school where you go for like an extra 3 years, like it's like 9 years. That would help prepare you for college, to go to a university and get like a specialized degree. Then you do the 9 years, then you go to college, basically. So that's something the Germans were kind of known for doing. Germans also dealt with what they call kindergarten. I've heard of that, where they started educating people at like 5 years old and things like that. That's something the Germans did, a long time ago in education. Just kind of talking about some of these reforms, etc. Here's a map showing you the growth of the Prussian state. So you can see, started out as a very small state, mostly in these areas, like up here, kind of in the orange area here. They start adding like Brandenburg, and then you can see how the territory starts expanding up to like the 18th century. So by the time of Frederick's reign, and then I think Frederick William, I want to say second, that's about the size of the German state over time, Germany's going to gobble up like the northern territories, well, what was the Holy Roman Empire, because Holy Roman Empire, of course, breaks up in 1806. And I'll get to it later, but there's a kind of a debate about, what should be, in this German state later, because, the Prussian state for a long time try to unify, the Prussian state into like German, like a confederation later, which will take a long time, up to the 19th century. There was a debate about whether Austria should be in it and other countries like that in southern Germany, but eventually it's going to exclude them, over time. But that'll be later, of course, when that will, of course, happen. Now, I wanted to go back and talk about Frederick the Great. That the other thing that he's also known for, Frederick, if you know about his, time in power overall, he was seen as this military genius. I think a lot of people kind of compare him to often Napoleon Bonaparte or an early Napoleon Bonaparte, because Napoleon was this statesman that was originally a general, and so he's kind of seen as like similar to that overall. So Frederick was a military genius on the battlefield. He often led troops in battle. I think there were several times where he had his horse shot out from under him, and things like that in battles. He's very famous for popularizing a famous military type tactic that's called the oblique order, where it's a type of attack where an army attacks an enemy flank. It's something he's kind of known for in popularizing throughout Europe. And it was kind of showing here the so-called oblique order right here in this image. Originally, the oblique order was something that the Greeks popularized, like back in the 4th century BC. There was a famous battle called the Battle of Leuctra, where the Theban forces, like Thebes, defeated Sparta, like a major Greek power in, Hellenic or Greek age, a long time ago. You had the Greek city-states in ancient Greece. And it was like a flank attack where the Thebes attacked the right flank of Sparta by concentrating their forces on one side, and they ended up basically routing them. Alexander the Great did a lot of these kind of maneuvers as well in a lot of his battles when he fought the Persian Empire, when he conquered the Near East all the way to India. That was back in the late 4th century as well. They think the battle that kind of repopularized the use of the so-called oblique order was later in the 7 Years' War, where Frederick really had his greatest tactical victory, where he defeated an Austrian force that outnumbered his 2-1. The famous Battle of Leuthen, of course, that's well known. I probably won't talk about it today, but the Battle of Leuthen, I think was an interesting battle because of the fact that it was this battle where I think his troops, he had 30,000 and Austrian force had 60,000, and he did this maneuver where he outflanked them on one side, kind of tricked them, I think what happened was the Austrians thought the attack was going to come on their right flank, but it was on the left flank. And he basically concentrated his force on one flank and rolled up that side of their army and destroyed it. And so I think some people also call it like where they roll up a flank of an army. This has been done a lot in a lot of battles, like Civil War. They've done these kind of, American Civil War. They had these kind of battles as well. So I kind of popularized that where people try to turn each other's flank in battle and things like that. I think the Battle of Bull Run was like that. The first Battle of Bull Run, they tried to turn each other's flank and kind of like that kind of maneuver. Napoleon did all these tactics too, later as well. Now I was going to get to it as well, but the Silesian Wars, which is right here, is considered to be really Frederick's greatest conflict that he was in. They had the 7 Years' War later, which was in the 1750s and 60s, but that wasn't as great of a war compared to the Silesian Wars, which were actually a series of 3 wars: First, Second, and Third Silesian Wars. In the War of the Austrian Succession, he fought like 2 of them. The first, and I think in the Second Silesian War, against mostly Austria, I think with some French aid. And part of why Frederick the Great wanted control of Silesia, which you see is in that red area in the map, is because Silesia, which is now a majority in Poland today, was rich in minerals. It had things like iron ore, coal, zinc, lead, copper. These are things that they could increase the size and development of their kingdom and their military. I think iron ore and coal is the main things they had the most. That's important. And up to I want to say World War II, Germany controlled that area until after the war. They lost it. If you know about that, after World War II. In fact, Germany lost a lot of its eastern provinces. Like East Prussia, Silesia was all lost, of course, to Poland and other states. And one of the things that happened, after the Silesian Wars, Prussia and Austria became bitter enemies. They hated each other for a long time after that, up to I want to say the 1800s. And like I told you before, Maria Theresa hated Frederick, which is kind of ironic because Frederick had initially wanted to marry her. I think when he first came to power, he had this idea to marry her and maybe merge the 2 states together, or something like that. But it ended up causing this diplomatic revolution that occurred in Europe. And if you look at this map here, Europe changed afterwards. So-called diplomatic revolution, where the alliances in Europe that used to exist began to change. But before that, Prussia was allied with the Austrians, and Britain was allied with France. It's kind of the way it was, they think. But what ends up happening, is that they switch. So there's this reversal, long-standing alliances that they had in Europe for years. Austria switches to be allies with the French. And then you get Prussia allied with Britain. We'll explain later, but Britain, if you know about it, is taken over by the Hanover dynasty, which is in northern Germany. So that's why they ally together. There's got all these different Germans, German nobility that kind of merge together right there. And so you can see how all those 3 kind of join in. Other states too, Sweden, Russia, I think later little Spain as well, will kind of also join up with France and Austria. So that's kind of the alliances that you have set in Europe that occur. And this is important, by the way, because the fact that it's later going to cause the 7 Years' War to break out. I'm not going to talk about the 7 Years' War today because I think when I get to the French, like with the French Revolution and the decline of the French Empire in the 18th century, you're going to see how this worldwide conflict that's fought throughout the globe is going to affect all the balance of power in Europe. Britain's going to become a rising empire, overall. France declines, and of course it leads down the road to, of course, the French Revolution, because later on the French lose pretty much just almost all their territories in North America, which were part of their empire at the time. So it's kind of talking about all these different alliances that'll kind of affect Europe on down the line. By the way, a little bit about Frederick. Frederick, by the way, during that 7 years, we won't talk about it until later, but Prussia barely survived the war. Prussia started the war too. Like they say, like in Europe anyway, the 7 Years' War broke out because Frederick the Great wanted to seize control of Saxony too, second northern Germany, the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. That caused the war to spark. And Prussia at one point got overrun during the 7 Years' War. His state was almost destroyed. He came very close. Like half his armies were wiped out in the war, but he would later survive, of course, the war after that. I think I'll get to it later, but Russia has this miracle happen where the ruler of Russia, Empress Elizabeth, dies, and her nephew named Peter III takes over as Tsar. He's like a big fan of, of Frederick the Great, of course, who decides to sue for peace. Because I think Russia was going to come in and just overrun Prussia, along with Austria, France, and I think Sweden. But they end up surviving more or less. I think they often call it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg or something like that. It's often called when Prussia kind of survives the 7 Years' War later. Now, Frederick, by the way, did not have any children. He did have a wife. A lot of people don't know that. His wife was Elizabeth of Brunswick. He hated her guts, though. Couldn't stand her. There's kind of a debate about whether they even consummated the marriage or not. They're not sure about that. Frederick was gay. And so the throne went to his nephew, Frederick William II, who would reign up to 1797 after that. And I think he had a son named Frederick William III that would be the king of Prussia when Napoleon would invade Europe and all that. And so basically the throne of Prussia, a lot of the kings later are really through one of his nephews that follow in general. Of course, I showed you earlier, these are some of the palaces, of course, he was known for. Frederick the Great, of course, already, of course, had that video, Sans Souci, that was built in the 1740s. Type of Rococo style, like late Baroque type style architecture. And of course, as you know, that's the site of where Frederick the Great is buried. 1990 or 1991, I think, is when he was buried there, of course. And he had another palace which was well known, which was built later in his reign, which is called the New Palace, of course, at Potsdam. It's considered one of the last major Prussian Baroque-style palaces that was built in Germany, completed in 1769. And so these are all these different showy type palaces that were famously built. And a lot of the rulers, some of these, of course, reigned from some of these palaces, of course, later. Now I'm going to, of course, be moving on. Like later, of course, in the week, I'm going to be, of course, talking about the rise of Russia. That's my next thing. Of course, I'm going to get to the rise of Russian absolutism. I'll kind of actually go all the way back to the Middle Ages, because if you know about the Russian state, it was actually started by Viking peoples. They were either called Varangian or the Rus people. So we'll talk about that. I'll talk about how Russia struggles through the Middle Ages, because at one point, Russia gets invaded by the Mongol Empire. It actually takes over Russia. They control it as like one of the Khanates I think it's called the Golden Horde Khanate for a while. Now we'll get to the rise of the different kinds of czars. You have the Rurik dynasty, was the initial dynasty of rulers and czars. They controlled Russia, like Ivan III and his grandson, Ivan IV the Terrible. So we'll talk about that. Then I'll get to the Romanov dynasty as well, which is really the most famous dynasty, of course, of the Russian state, which rules up from the 1917 to World War I. So I'll talk about primarily the rulers of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, who come in and try to modernize, of course, the Russian state, because Russia tries to kind of be this major power, like all these other powers, of course, in Europe as well. So that's pretty much it today, of course, for lecture 3. But like I said, part 4 will be coming up later in the week, and I'll have future announcements, of course, coming up about that. Don't forget, of course, I told you about various assignments that are out there. Of course, you need to work on. If you haven't, of course, finished the Conquest of America quiz, wrap that up. I believe that's due this week sometime. I'll send out reminders, of course, about trying to finish that up. And then, of course, second vocab will later be due in October, early October sometime as well. But like I said, this week we are going to have, of course, our upcoming first exam, which will be, like I said, on the Age of Absolutism. All these 4 lectures, of course, I'm of course doing on that from French, Habsburgs, Prussia, and of course Russia as well. So if you have any questions, of course, about this lecture, please let me know later, of course, on my channel. Doesn't look like there's any other questions. I think I had one earlier I had. I think it was Kayla, I believe it was. Also, if you want to subscribe to my channel, also you can as well. I think there's a subscribe button down at the top, bottom right. So y'all take care, and I'll see y'all later, of course, in the rest of the week. So have a great week,